Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to week 3 of Psych 1000, and we will be covering this week chapter 2, okay, on neuroanatomy and neuroscience, neurochemistry. But just by kind of a quick review in terms of some of the important parts of the brain that are relevant for psychology as well as particular neurotransmitters, yeah, relevant to that come up in the psychological research all the time. So with that, let me call up my screen and call this forward. And let's see, we will start here. Very good. Alrighty then. So without further ado, let's do. So first on this chapter of concerning you know, the brain and so on, and a lot of those issues I just mentioned. The first area that's covered is research methods in biological psychology, but I'm going to kind of bypass that. Yeah, feel free to look over it in your copy of the PowerPoint slide, which is uploaded on Blackboard. I'm just going to kind of bypass that and just start with the brain. Okay, so first at the get-go, before we talk about the highways and byways of the central and peripheral nervous system, let's talk about its smallest, well, not the smallest, but for general purposes of for general discussions about the brain, the smallest part of the brain, the neuron. Yeah, as you may be familiar, the neuron, which makes up both the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, but in the brain consists, makes up, includes about billions and billions of neurons in the brain. And what the parts of the neuron include the cell body. Again, let me find my cursor here. Cell body, the dendrites, which pick up information, and the axon, which passes information to other neurons. Okay. The axon is covered by this kind of gelatinous material here, right? Referred to as the myelin sheath. Now, the purpose of the myelin sheath is kind of a fatty tissue that covers the axon and serves kind of as a coating or covering to protect the axon, kind of like as plastic covers a wire. Okay. What it does is it also facilitates communication of information from the cell body through the axon. And we'll talk about that communication in a moment. All righty. And whenever there's greater activity of the neuron, yeah, so for example, what would be great activity? Great activity, let's just say for someone playing a musical instrument, right? When someone plays a musical instrument, they will stimulate or excite particular neurons, yeah, related to motor functioning, auditory processing of information, maybe even visual information, right? As a person's visualizing musical scales. So whatever particular brain functions are stimulated, yeah, for particular behavior, yeah, those neurons, yeah, will be aroused, will be communicating information, yeah. And when the more neuron does so, the more it builds up that myelin sheath, right? That we find greater development of that myelin sheath. And it's probably related to being able to facilitate greater um, neuro communication, okay, or communication of the chemical information, which we'll get into in a moment. Alrighty. So there are about 100 billion neurons in our central and peripheral nervous system. Okay, a huge number there. And let's see. So you know, um, so in what? So how much is that given? So how dense is that? Well, in 1 cubic centimeter of the brain, yeah, there are about 15 million neurons. Alrighty, so that's how densely packed those 100 billion neurons are, and how many permutations and variations and interconnections there are within the brain. Alrighty, just as expansive as, let's say, our Milky Way galaxy. Okay, now there are a lot of myths regarding the brain, how it functions, what it does, what it can't do. During this course, we'll kind of sort through the wheat versus the chaff. Alrighty, but just at the get-go, as we're talking about the brain, what are some common myths about the brain? Okay, now, well, one is that you can lose brain cells uh, by with a lot of alcohol intoxication. Okay, well, as research actually seems to show, you don't actually lose those brain cells. They don't degenerate, okay, and disappear or evaporate or burnt off by alcohol. But they can actually diminish in size. And that's kind of interesting. You don't lose it, but they can shrink in size. The other is the Mozart effect. Yeah, that notion that if pregnant women, play Mozart, right, in the middle of their pregnancy, that will stimulate intellectual growth in their infants. All righty, and some have the personal experience, though, that may have been the case. All righty, where did that come from? That actually came from a study which actually had nothing to do with pregnant women or pregnancy and or infants. It actually had to do with the presentation of Mozart's work, right? By way of a classical symphonic performance of his work and how it affected cognitive functioning in a sample of college students, different IQ related tasks like attention and concentration and so forth. Yeah. How long did that effect last? About 20 minutes. So that's all the Mozart effect was able to demonstrate in one study. But from that one study, people kind of ran with the findings and made all these inferences about what listening to Mozart could do for your brain. All righty. And that's one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind with scientific findings. Right? What did they find? Yeah. And what can you infer from that finding? Yeah. Now, some studies you can make some pretty important inferences. Like if there are several studies showing drug A is superior to drug B, you can start making the inference that drug A is effective, right? Now, what is the number of studies, a magical number for what constitutes the cutoff? Don't know. It depends. Depends on the particular thing that you're studying, treatment, drug, whatever the phenomenon, how many studies does it take? Yeah. To be quite frank, in most instances, there are no hard, fast rules. Alrighty. If there are few studies, you probably, for drug research, you probably don't want to depend on a few studies. Yeah. For many drug studies, you usually want to rely on 1 or 2 dozen studies before you start, you know, uh, disseminating that drug among the general public, at the very least a couple dozen studies showing the same effect. Yeah, but there are no hard fast rules. It really depends on the particular phenomenon. The other brain myth is that we only use 10% of our brains, and oh my gosh, the things we could do if we use the other 90%. Okay, where did that 10% number come from? Well, it came from a non-neuroscience scientist, a big and important figure in psychology, who stated that we only use 10% of our potential. Yeah, and then that number was taken by and used by a popular pop psychology writer, Dale Carnegie, who also repeated that same notion that we only use 10% of our brains. Okay, now apart with most activities, yeah, it's usually about 10% of our brain is activated. Yeah? But that doesn't mean, there's a 90% we can't get past. It just appears that we only need to use about 10% for most things that we do day to day and so on, and for most intellectual tasks. Okay, that there are the other 90% of the brain we apparently don't need to use for processing of information and so on. Okay, so we mentioned before about the 100 billion neurons communicating to each other. Yeah, and there are different neurons for different functions, in part related to their location in different parts of the brain and so on. Yeah, or as they might manifest themselves in the peripheral nervous system, right, through the nervous system throughout the body. Okay, which we'll get into in a moment. But how do neurons communicate? Well, they communicate chemically. Yeah. So what happens is that the dendrites, right, will pick up will be signaled when they get in contact with certain chemicals. All righty. And when they get in touch with certain chemicals, all right, we won't get into the details of the nature of the neurochemistry, But there's a neurochemical reaction which sends essentially an electrical impulse, yeah, through the dendrites, through the cell body, and down through the axon. All righty, and when it and what the signal when it reaches when let me take a step back. When the dendrites pick up, certain chemicals, there's a kind of an unlocking of other chemicals through the dendrites in the cell body, and that when that occurs, that means that the particular neuron reached its action potential, right? And that's the action potential. When the action potential reaches the knob-like terminals um, at the axon's end, it triggers a release of chemicals, which then communicates with other neurons. Alrighty, so chemicals to dendrites, right? The action potential occurs, goes through the axon, then the axon of that cell releases chemicals, which are then picked up by another neuron, okay? Either by the dendrites of the subsequent neuron, right? So kind of a repetition of that process, or by the subsequent neuron cell body, okay? Now, these chemicals are referred to as neurotransmitters, okay? And generally, most psychological psychiatric research tends to focus on a couple dozen different neural transmitters. Okay, the neurotransmitters bind to receptor sites on a neuron, yeah, on the dendrites or as I mentioned before, on the neuron body. Okay, dendrites pick it up, or on the neuron body. Okay, and when these chemicals, right, they bind to receptors, you can kind of see, view, or analogize the chemicals to keys, right, kind of fitting into holes or locks, right? So keyholes. And when there's a match between the chemical structure with the receptor, then we have the action potential being stimulated. Okay. Now, here is a cut of the brain as if the brain were facing you, and then there's a cut through it. All righty. Some of the main structures I just want to kind of highlight here. Let me move this image here this way. Okay, is all right. So if let's just I'm sorry. I think this is actually as if you're looking from the back of the brain, and the back of the person's to you, of this brain, the back of the brain's to you, and then facing away, and then we got to cut centrally, right, down the brain, right. So this would be the top. This would be the brain stem, and then the left and right hemisphere. Okay, the left side, the right side. Okay. Now, the brain is covered by, right, gray matter, and within it, what's referred to as white matter. Okay. Now, the gray matter essentially consists of dendrites, neurons, right, dendrite cell body, and axons. Right. The white matter consists of the axons as they extend to other areas or other gray matter areas. Okay, communicating, making interconnections, and communicating signals to other gray matter areas. All righty, this is brain stem. Here later we'll talk about, this is a space right in the center of the brain, referred to as the ventricle. And right between here, you have a bunch of fibers. It's not illustrated here, called the corpus callosum. Okay, of the different types of neurotransmitters, these are the major ones that come up time and time again in psychological research. As I mentioned, there are actually about a couple dozen different neurotransmitters that are investigated regularly, but these are the main ones that come up a lot and will certainly come up in our discussions. Yeah? The first is dopamine. Now, this chemical is associated with what's referred to as executive functions, yeah, or parts of the brain that's involved in organizing, planning, but also impulse control. Yeah, that ability to not act on your hunger or sex drives or aggressive impulses, right? To kind of modulate that or manage that. Okay. It's also it's associated with a whole bunch of things actually. As if executive functions weren't enough, it's also associated with sequential thought processes. And another big one is the experience of pleasure or reinforcement. Yeah. So, for example, the reinforcing aspects of substance use. Okay. Very closely tied with dopamine. Right? And other important functions such as learning and attention. Now, another neurotransmitter you may have heard the word before as associated with antidepressants is serotonin. Now, serotonin is associated with a mood, a lot of also basic functions like hunger, sleep, and arousal. Alrighty, and usually a low amount of serotonin is associated with depression and aggression. Yeah. But also, it's not, and actually, what a lot of research seems to suggest is that it's not so much the amount of serotonin, although I have it here indicated as low, but it actually probably has more to do with the receptors. Yeah, problems with the receptors picking up on the neurotransmitter or picking it up, but not then picking up the key, but then not unlocking the door, allowing for the action potential to take action and then go down and lead the excitatory impulse down the axon. Another neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is associated with alertness and arousal. Alrighty. Now, high amount of norepinephrine has actually been associated with aggressive or violent behavior. You know, we tend to see more of that, or sensitivity to norepinephrine among individuals who suffer from violent problems, violent tendencies. Acetylcholine is involved in muscle action, gross motor functioning. You think of running, walking, writing. Acetylcholine is involved or implicated. Okay, as well as learning and memory. Now, GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Yeah, so involved in inhibiting certain actions, motor actions, and so on. And glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in learning processes and memory. Okay, now how do drugs work? Okay, well, medications, legal or illegal, work by either, stimulating or inhibiting neurotransmitters. Alrighty. So agonists are those kinds of substances, legal or illegal, right, which tend to excite the production of neurotransmitters, make them more present. Yeah. So even with serotonin and depression, where depression may be more a function of problems with the receptors. Yeah, the way the drug typically works is by exciting stimulation of serotonin, so making it more present. Yeah, or as an agonist, it either excites stimulation of serotonin or mimics it. Right, kind of looks like the key. Alrighty. Or what it does is that it blocks reuptake. Now, I didn't mention this before, but during this process of chemical communication between neurons, one thing that typically occurs is after a chemical has gone between axon to dendrite or cell body, yeah, and then the action potential has been activated, there's usually kind of a vacuuming up of the chemical by the axon, okay? Removing the neurotransmitter. Well, in cases where there seems to be a decrease in communication of the particular neurotransmitter, one of the things that can facilitate communication of it is by keeping that chemical in the synapse for a longer period of time, or in other words, blocking that vacuuming up process so that the neurotransmitter lingers in the synapse or that space between axon and dendrite. Yeah, so it allows, if there's any problem with receiving that chemical, receiving that key, it allows the dendrite or the cell body a little more time to be affected by the neurotransmitter. And antagonists are those things which inhibit or decrease Yeah. So maybe with aggressivity, you want to decrease the amount of neurotransmitter. So it inhibits the production of neurotransmitter, or it blocks the lock by which, norepinephrine, that neurotransmitter, can enter the lock. Okay. If you want to decrease norepinephrine, right, in someone who has violent tendencies, you kind of block the lock for that neurotransmitter. Alrighty, so we talked about the neuron, neurochemistry, how the neuron functions, how the chemicals stimulate a signal through the neuron, how the different neurons operate for different abilities. Now let's talk about the highways and the byways of the nervous system. Okay. Now you can think of the nervous system as being broken down into two subsystems. Yeah, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The CNS concerns the brain, for the most part, the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system, right, the periphery or outer area, deals with the highways and byways of the nervous system that extends beyond the spinal cord, right? So from the spinal cord to all parts of the body, the eyeballs, eardrums, fingertips, right, muscles, organs, and so on. Now, you can break down the peripheral nervous system into two subsystems, the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay, we'll explain those two in a moment. And even the autonomic nervous system, you can break down into two subsystems, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay, so initial, sub, and I guess, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so this would be two subsystems, subsystems, and then finally under the peripheral nervous systems, and then under the autonomic nervous systems, sub, I guess, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. All right, so the nervous system concerns the interconnection of neurons and how they communicate with each other. Yeah, as I mentioned, the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord here. Okay. And the peripheral nervous system, right? The connections of nerve fibers, neurons, from the spinal cord outward. Okay. Among the neurons, didn't mention this before, there are three general types. Sensory neurons, which pick up information, interneurons, which facilitate communications between the sensory and the motor neurons, and then finally the motor neurons, which send out information. Okay. Now let's talk about the peripheral nervous system, and later we'll get back to the brain and spinal cord. This peripheral nervous system, as I mentioned before, has two subsystems, the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system, right, the body, soma, right, that nervous system controls the movement of skeletal muscles, right, which obviously involves a whole bunch of functions, walking, talking, writing, and so on. All righty. The autonomic nervous system is that system of nerves that controls glands and muscles of our internal organs. Okay, so it includes, right, operation of the lungs and heart, and also involved in muscle movement. Alrighty, so this for skeletal muscles, and then muscles for all the other functions. And now it's called autonomic because these the functions related to this system, the majority of them are automatic in nature, yeah, involuntary. Yeah? So for example, your heart, you can't stop that. Right, it's it's on automatic pilot. Yeah, and there are a number of functions which are going on, which are operating all the time, right? Like the heart, digestive system, and so on, right? That are on automatic pilot, right? And that's related to this system. Now, there are two subsystems under the autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous systems. Alrighty. The big difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic is that this is involved in excitatory activity. Okay, so facilitating heart rate, sweating, and so on. And this is related to chilling us out, reducing activity. Alrighty, so slowing down the heart, um, and so on, reducing breathing, and so on, right? So think of a symphony, right? That's exciting people as the music gets um, more involved and going at a faster rate, right? Faster pace. Versus parasympathetic, which is the symphony cooling down, going in the opposite direction. Now, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Alrighty. Now, at the spinal cord, there are a number of neural tracts, right? Long fibers that are going up, sending up sensory information. Yeah. The brain also receives sensory information from other organs not on the spinal cord, such as from the eyes and the ears, yeah, from the tongue for taste, okay, so sight, sound, and taste, alrighty. But for things such as tactile sensations, touch, yeah, that extends throughout the body, okay. Oh, don't forget smell, and that again, not on from the spinal cord, but from the nose itself, alrighty. And there are also, as we have ascending tracts, sending information up the spinal cord or from the organs like the eyes, the ears, nose, and so on, straight to the brain. We have a number of descending neural tracts, which sends motor information back to the highways and byways of through the peripheral nervous system. From descending tracts down the spinal cord, sending signals to the peripheral nervous system. Yeah. So as the brain gives signals to walk, talk, and write, and so on. You know, I mentioned twice about talking being a motor behavior. And one thing that's kind of an interesting question is, what did our brain kind of evolve? When the brain, right? Well, when the species evolved, right? The brain evolved with it. And as the human brain evolved and developed, right, what did it evolve or develop for? Yeah. Was it for thinking? Well, in part, right? It's not an either or mutually exclusive thing. It isn't one thing precedes the other, or was it for another function? Yeah. And arguably, initially, and for a big part of our lifespan of our species, yeah, the brain's evolution has been more so for movement. Yeah. As I mentioned before, walking, no, I didn't mention before, but walking is certainly a complex movement. Tons of other complex movement functions like hunting and, food gathering and so on, but speech as well. Yeah. In order to speak, involves a really complex operation of a number of things with the jaw, the tongue, and so on. Yeah. And that clearly was related to, later, language development and thought development. And certainly it can be argued that a big part of that development related to how the brain initially primarily was evolved as a function of movement, evolving a more complex movement. Yeah. So it's big, I guess you can think of as the big pull wasn't necessarily to develop, do more complex cognitive analysis or functions, but more to do complex motor behavior. Alrighty, let's talk about the brain. Now, one way I like to talk about, that's not just me, a number of people like to talk about the brain is try to think about it in terms of lower and upper structures. Yeah, for me, I like to think about a house. Yeah, there are certain lower structures or parts of the house, like the basement, and then upper parts, right? Like the middle part of the house, where you have the kitchen and living room, and then the upper part where you have bedrooms and the attic. Yeah, I think that's kind of a helpful way to think about parts of the brain and what it does. Right? So lower levels of the house, like the basement and so on, right, deal with more basic things, right? Like there you got the hot water generator and maybe a lot of the wiring for the electricity starts off in the basement. And similarly, the brain, you have important lower brain structures which are involved in more basic but really important life supporting functions. Right? Whereas in the upper parts of the house, right, you deal with more complex stuff, not less of the life supporting stuff, related to life and facilitating life, but more complex behaviors. Yeah, besides just eating and sleeping and so on, right? And in the upper part of the house, you have, or in the brain, you have what you have the cortex and hemispheres, which are more involved in complex human behaviors and cognitive processes. Now, if we look at the lower level brain structures, yeah, let's start off with the brain. What we'll be focusing in on will be the brain stem. Yeah, so the brain stem is that area where we have which arises from the spinal column and enters the brain. Yeah, and you can see it almost looks like a mini brain within the larger brain. Now, there are three major structures to be familiar with. The first is the medulla, and the medulla is involved in really basic operations, heartbeat and breathing. Yeah. So this is something you don't want to be damaged, and it's kind of handy that it's kind of tucked in here, right? It's harder to reach, harder to access by way of a head blow, blow to the head, sorry, and because if that uh, isn't functioning, yeah, in about a minute, that's about it for the person, all right, because it stops the heart and stops breathing. The next right above it is the reticular formation. Okay? The reticular formation filters and relays information from the rest of the body to different parts of the brain. All righty, so as it gets signals from the fingertips to the bottom, from the bottom of the feet, that information is relayed in the reticular formation, all right, to other parts of the brain, relevant parts of the brain. It's also, excuse me, involved in arousing, getting us alert. Yeah, so as we're waking up, this is a thing which will help us kick into action. Okay, or at the end of the day, right, this is going to be slowing down, decreasing our arousal. Alrighty. And finally, we have the thalamus, right, which looks like a mini brain perched right on top, at the very top of the brainstem. Now, the thalamus, I'm going to drop some little memory cues that I like to use that kind of help me remember different parts of the brain. And this is the first. For thalamus, I like to think of the name Sally, right? And I like to think of a character that I made up called Sally the sensory switchboard lady. All righty, Sally sensory switchboard, thalamus. And what Sally is doing, right, is she's relaying sensory information to different relevant parts of the brain, right? So sensory information includes touch, could include other sensations such as balance, right, through the rest of the body. And also it can include sensory information, obviously sight and sound and taste and smell, right? That all gets kind of integrated here, and then relevant signals sent to whatever relevant parts of the brain. So whatever sight information, where that might be processed, right? Or sound information, where that may be processed, and then what it may relate to, right? So it may be, let's just say, you're a musician in a band, and you hear the drummer playing, right? You're the guitar player, and you want to play to the drummer's beat, yeah? So you get that information, and that information is relayed by Sally, the sensory switchboard lady, to motor behavior, yeah? Your behavior, your hands on the guitar, all righty? So taking that sensory information and sending it to the relevant parts of the brain. Oh, by the way, this is an example of a medication. It's called Adderall. All righty, and Adderall is related to ADHD. It tends to be a very effective medication in treating ADHD, and one of the reasons why it actually is a stimulant, right? It arouses a person, which seems counterintuitive, right? You think someone who's ADHD, man, the last thing they need is to be aroused. All righty. Well, in part, the problem with those who struggle with ADHD, yeah, is that a lot of the behaviors arguably are attempts to arouse themselves, right? They're kind of bored as they're sitting there. Because of the balance of neurochemicals in their brain, right? Well, it's controversial, right? To what extent it's neurochemical versus learning. But for the most part, as we're looking at a drug, we'll talk from a neurochemical perspective. The idea is that on a neurochemical level, the ADHD patient typically has difficulty getting aroused. So they arouse themselves by, talking out of turn, or, monkeying around with other people when they shouldn't, right? Getting up from their chair in class and, walking around, touching other people and stuff like that. And the idea behind Adderall is that if you can stimulate those neurochemicals which produce arousal, then the hyperactive child will be less inclined to do that themselves by behaviorally. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. The other thing it seems to be really effective in is in facilitating attention and control, impulse control. Yeah, particularly attention. So, but the thing is, it's very effective in those who don't suffer from ADHD. Yeah. So people who don't suffer from ADHD, they actually can experience increased attention and concentration by using Adderall. You should only be using Adderall if you are suffering from ADHD. Do not take someone else's prescription. Alrighty. Unfortunately, it's not an uncommon thing for people to do that. Don't do that. Don't use medications you weren't prescribed. Moving right along. Alrighty, getting back to the brainstem, yeah, you can. So with this illustration, this is as if you're like a little ant and you're looking up at the brain, and this is the spinal cord and this brain stem. This is the front of the brain. Imagine some eyeballs here. This is the back of the brain. So at the back of the brain, we have this structure called the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is critical in coordinating voluntary movement. Yeah, so that's a ton of stuff: walking, talking, writing, but particularly walking. Yeah, and as I mentioned to you before, walking is a really complex motor behavior. I mean, human beings, we take it for granted. Yeah, but if it were easy, everyone would be walking. All other species would be walking. But there are, obviously a number of other reasons why other species haven't evolved to walk. But for us, yeah, we have done that, and it was very difficult for us from an engineering perspective to recreate that in robots. I mean, it really took decades. I mean, now we see some in robotics, some really great and wonderful examples of how robots have been kind of built and programmed to walk. But that did not happen overnight. That really took at least a couple decades to get down. If you saw some of the early models or attempts at robotics to get walking down, it was a mess, because it is a very tricky motoric behavior to coordinate and to balance, to do it right. The other thing with the cerebellum, it was actually for the longest time assumed or thought to be primarily involved, almost exclusively involved in motoric behaviors, and as I said, particularly walking. But now it's actually been found to have a big role in memory consolidation. Yeah. So this goes for a lot of the structures we're talking about. I'm going to be talking about their principal function that they're associated with. But here's a couple of things. One, very often structures have a number of functions. And here's the other thing too: for a particular function, let's just say experiencing an emotion, that is almost never just due to one brain structure. It's usually some combination of brain structures and some complex combination of neurons. Yeah. So that's an important thing to come to appreciate. All right, that every structure usually has multiple functions, and that for any function, it usually involves multiple structures and neurons. Alrighty, let's talk about the limbic system. Now, the limbic system, you can kind of see as being the middle portion of the house. Yeah, where the living room is and bedrooms are, living room and maybe the kitchen and so on. Okay. Now, the limbic system is particularly associated with a lot of the key things that really make us human. Yeah. Like the lower brain structures, are related to behaviors and actions, which can be characteristic of many other species. But the limbic system tends to be associated more with humans, and particular mammals, and more broadly mammals. Yeah, and here the limbic system is primarily involved in memory and also emotional coordination, emotional uh, the experience of emotions and manifestation of emotions. Now, some of the structures to kind of keep you here a number of times through the semester will include things such as the hippocampus. Okay, now the hippocampus, which is located right around here, okay, this structure is involved in the consolidation of memories. Yeah, has a very key role, and it's one of those areas. It's that of a number of other neuroanatomical phenomena that's associated with dementia. Yeah. So Alzheimer's patients very typically have some kind of dysfunction associated with the hippocampus. Right. Now here's another memory device. I always remember hippocampus being remembered with being associated with memory because I just think, you know, that old saying about elephants have great memories. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's an old one. That elephants have great memories. Well, I just think, well, what's another big mammal? Hippos, right? So hippocampus. Hey man, that's the best I can come up with. Alrighty. Now, another structure to be familiar with is the amygdala. It's right here. Now, the amygdala is implicated in modulating aggression and fear, right? Fight or flight responses. So really critical in our evolution and our ability to adapt to the environment, right? Being aware of our environment, cautious, and so on. And being aggressive when we need to. The other is the hypothalamus. Yeah. Now, it might sound a little familiar, right? Hypothalamus, right? So whenever I think of hypothalamus, I think of lower Sally. Okay, this is going to sound a little elitist, awful, but I think of this as another character. It's not regular Sally, but it's lower Sally. All right, hypo, kind of reduced, right? Lower Sally, and she's involved. She's like the maintenance lady, so she's involved in hunger and sleep and sex, sexual functions, right? All the lower stuff. Um, and basic stuff, right? But certainly important for our functioning. And finally, the pituitary gland. Yeah, that's involved, that influences hormone release by other glands, which are involved in other behavioral and emotional functions. Okay, let me get out of this for a moment. Hello, everybody. I'm back. Just took a little Red Bull break, but let's continue. Okay, so that's the limbic system or midbrain area. Oh, by the way, I have this picture of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby. And what reason why I have this picture is what's kind of interesting was after Jack Ruby had assassinated Lee Oswald, right? He died. He was the alleged the suspect implicated in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. A couple days later, Jack Ruby, being all forlorn and angry and upset, went up and shot Lee Harvey Oswald. Years later, when Jack Ruby died, his brain, he went through an autopsy. What's kind of interesting is that his autopsy showed that he was suffering from brain cancer, which actually surrounds a large part of his brain. And it kind of leads one to kind of suspect that, gee, maybe a few years prior, that brain cancer was affecting his emotional regulation, yeah, his limbic system. But, you know, that's speculation, but kind of a little interesting historical tidbit. Now, in terms of the upper level, the second floor of the house, yeah, that's where we typically have the bedrooms, and then above that, the attic with all the photo albums and other stuff stored by the family. Hopefully, good stuff. Nothing, you know, bad. So, in terms of the higher level brain structures, the first one I like to talk about, kind of touched on earlier with one of the initial slides, the cerebral cortex. Yeah. So we're talking about this kind of covering of the brain with gray matter. That gray matter is mostly composed of, I think of it as, it's kind of a dark grayish pink. Um, and it basically consists of, right, the neurons, particularly the dendrite cell body and axons. okay? But the white matter below, including just primarily the axons, right, which are connecting all the gray matter to each other. All right, the cerebral cortex, which is about 1 to 2 millimeters thick or thin, as the case may be, is what's involved in complex thought processes, right? Analytical thinking, language, all the kind of stuff which makes us human, right? Allows us to, write great pieces of literature, poetry, symphonies, and make atom bombs. All righty, so all the stuff that makes us human. Is related to this. Now, other species do have, cerebral cortices, but ours, there are a number of things that differentiate ours. One are the number of convolutions or twists and turns you see here. Yeah, that's been kind of associated or theorized to be associated with, to explain why we're more complex in our thinking. The other has to do with the amount of association areas. Okay. Well, first let me talk about two other areas, then we'll talk about the association areas. Now, one area called this motor area, okay, is illustrated, it's not pink, but it's highlighted in this illustration by the color pink. Okay. This strip is involved in integrating the complex thought with motor behavior. In the back is a coordination of sensory information with complex thinking and other functions. Alrighty, so the motor strip, and in blue, the sensory strip. Now, the rest of the brain can be associated, is referred to as the association areas. Now, the association areas are huge, right? They include our ability to make connections and interconnections and complex connections with different types of stimuli out in the environment, with memories, with tactile stimulation and other senses and so on. And what really makes our brain unique, right, the cerebral cortex unique from other species, is the proportion of the brain that are allocated to association areas, right? A little bit with the mouse, a little bit with the cat, a little more with the chimpanzee, but much more for us. All righty? And again, it's not the size of the brain per se, right? Because whales have huge brains, but why aren't they writing symphonies or writing books? They probably do demonstrate a level of intelligence that we have yet to ascertain. But that aside, right, we don't see evidence of much more complex, of the kind of complex thinking humans can do. And again, despite the size of the brain, it's the amount of it devoted to association areas. Now, the other thing to be aware of with the higher structures of the brain is that, well, for the brain in general, is how the brain can be divided up into different hemispheres. Alrighty. Now, the hemispheres you can think of as regions, right? These kind of balloon regions of the brain. So here, the four main ones are the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Now, the temporal lobe is involved in the processing of auditory information, but also language and analytical thinking. But the parietal lobe, particularly for mathematical and analytical thinking. Yeah. The occipital lobe is associated, interesting enough, it being from the opposite, being located in the complete opposite side of the head from the eyes, but it's involved in visual processing, right? And a whole chunk of the brain is involved in that because of how we've been evolved to rely and use visual information. And finally, we have the frontal lobe. Yeah. And early in our discussion today, I discussed how the frontal lobe is involved. No, I probably didn't say frontal lobe. I don't think I mentioned that. But in terms of executive functions, and that executive functions, actually, I don't even think I mentioned executive functions today. I think that was for another class, another YouTube video. But the frontal lobe, just get to it, Vince. The frontal lobe is involved in executive functions, alrighty? And executive functions are associated with huge things, such as organizing, planning, and also other things such as emotional regulation and impulse control. Yeah, so a lot of stuff here, alrighty? The brain can also be divided into left and right hemispheres. So you can think of this as the left hemisphere, and then this other side, the right hemisphere. And in most right-handed people, the left hemisphere usually is associated mostly with language functions, whereas the right is involved in more right or spatial perceptual tasks. Alrighty. Um, but those are all big generalities. Yeah, with left-handed people being kind of flipped as a general matter, or with left-handed people, it tends to be either flipped in terms of the functions of the left and right hemispheres, or they tend to be more evenly distributed. All right. Finally, we have the corpus callosum. As I mentioned before, you can't see it in this picture, but it's a bundle of fibers around here that go from the left to the right side of the brain that connect the functions. It's like kind of a major highway connecting a whole bunch of other roads and off ramps and on ramps in the highway. All righty. With that, we will skip this. I'll talk about it probably a little later. We'll skip that. Well, one thing I just want to touch on. When it comes to the brain, you know, what some of you may or may not be familiar with is when Albert Einstein died, I think he died, it was like somewhere in the early 50s, I believe. I may be off at that. But one of the things he gave Princeton University, because that's where he was a faculty member, permission, I think it was Princeton University, was permission to do an autopsy of his brain because he was such an incredible, you know, he was a genius and such an incredible mind that made amazing contributions to science and to where we are now as a species. He allowed medical examiners to do an autopsy of his brain to examine specifically how his brain may have been different from most other people's brains. Yeah. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that when it comes to brain mass, yeah, and you know, brain size can sometimes have an effect on overall intellectual functioning. Yeah, but the size of his brain about the same as the average brain. Yeah, so the mass or weight of his brain was the same, was average. Okay, now there were a couple other differences though. One of which was his parietal lobe was 15%, 15% larger than most parietal lobe regions for most people, which kind of makes sense because of his great mathematical, analytical abilities. Yeah, as you may or may not be familiar, you know, in kind of stark contrast to, you know, there's a lot of legend and lore about, you know, Einstein failing math when he was in grade school or high school or something like that. I mean, in the actual historical fact is that when he was at university, he, at the end of his university career, he, like other students, had to take a comprehensive exam. And he technically failed at that, right? But it depends what you mean by fail. He failed several subjects, but not physics and math, which he excelled in. But other things such as literature, I think it was the French language, I think history, he failed because he just didn't give a damn and he never studied. He thought there was no reason for him to study those areas, and so he failed in those areas. He took the exam again and passed. Once he got passed, so it wasn't an intellectual thing; it was more of a stubborn thing. So that's the reality. That's the reality as opposed to the legend of lore. Because the reality was he actually he demonstrated really great math skills. He was a prodigy in math, even as in grade school. Like I believe at about age 10, he was already doing college level calculus. He may have been more like 12 or 13, but I believe he was as young as 10 or fourth grade. So that accounts for why his parietal lobe was about 50% larger. The other thing was his corpus callosum, the fibers that connected the left and right parts of his brain was, and I don't remember the exact percentage, but was bigger than most or thicker than most. You know, that aside, that isn't so unique to Einstein, in that it's been also found that when medical examiners have done autopsies of musicians' brains, there's often musicians tend to have a thicker, larger corpus callosum than the average non-musician brain. Alrighty, and that probably has to do with the fact that playing a musical instrument, by the way, as an aside, it is great for the brain because it really fosters neuronal connections with all kinds of different things, with emotion, with visual spatial processing, language abilities, and all kinds of things. It's just the brain is absolutely lit up on their brain scans when people are playing a musical instrument. And it really suggests the uh, neuro, neuronal benefits of playing a musical instrument. But yeah, his was bigger than most, but you know, most musicians' corpus callosum tend to be a little bigger, thicker than most people's. Okay, so kind of interesting about Einstein's brain. With that, that's all I have to say about the brain. Yeah, in chapter 2. So with that, I will see you in our next class meeting about this stuff. And with that, thanks for the privilege of your time, and take care, and I'll see you at the next YouTube video. Bye-bye.